Hello, I'm Jania Kaplan Quinn, a member of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills and the executive editor of Consensus Digital Media. I want to welcome you to our Yom Kippur Contemporary Issues Forum and Barrett Conversation. We want to thank the Barrett Family Foundation for funding our ongoing series of difficult conversations, diving into subjects of contemporary debate to understand various perspectives and insights, including those that may differ from our own. Today, our topic is changing times, rethinking monuments, and what they commemorate. From the removal of Confederate monuments during the protests to the controversy over the renaming of military bases, we are seeing the battle over monuments start to carry over into other areas of civic life. Particularly in a way history gets commemorated and conveyed in our educational system. Our guest today will help us understand what it is at stake for people on all sides of this conversation, and how might a country re-examine the darker moments of its history without losing a cohesive national identity. I'd like to welcome our speakers. We have Christy Coleman. She's an American historian, executive director of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, and former president and chief operating officer of the American Civil War Museum. When the American Civil War Museum opened in Richmond, Virginia, she oversaw the center's merger with the Museum of the Confederacy and co-led the Monument Avenue Commission that created a process of public input to determine how to approach the city's Confederate monuments. In recognition of her efforts, Time magazine named her one of their 31 people changing the South in 2018 for being unafraid to wade into the middle of conversations. She has also testified before Congress about these processes and issues. We'd also like to welcome Consul General Stefan Schneider. He currently serves as the German Consul General here in Los Angeles. Before this, he served as the head of Cultural Affairs Department at the German Embassy in Rome. He's also served as the head of Legal and Consular Section in Thailand, head of the Trade and Commerce Section in Bulgaria, Deputy Consul General in Miami, Counselor of Political Affairs in Paris, and Consul General in Izmir. He comes from a mixed Catholic Jewish heritage and has a deep personal interest in the questions of how nations, Germany in particular, use public space to address dark historical eras. Rabbi Bassin will take the first 45 minutes or so to interview the panelist. Then we can take questions from the audience. Please use the chat to write your questions. We will take as many as we can. Let's welcome our guest, and I'll turn it over to Rabbi Bassin.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you for all of the work that you've done as part of our Jews of Color Task Force over the course of the year that has enabled the foundation for this conversation. And, it often happens that our conversation series on Yom Kippur taps into something really timely. And of course, this year is no different, as we recently saw in the news this week about the removal of the final Confederate statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. And Christy Coleman, as you heard from her introduction, was part of a commission that was designed to incorporate public input and grapple with how the city ought to deal with these Confederate monuments and kind of these changing times. So Christy, I'm just curious if you have some insights to share in reflecting on the news of the past week.
Well, frankly, it has been really quite breathtaking. And I say that in that the work of the commission was pretty expansive. And the laws in the state were quite different at the time that we were tasked with that work. But the commission had 4 key recommendations at that time when we finished our work. And those recommendations were, first and foremost, that we felt that the various jurisdictions within the state needed to form a collaborative and get their legislators aligned and change state law that said you could not remove these, right? To give local control was the first recommendation. The second recommendation was that we felt that among the most egregious of these Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue was the Jefferson Davis Monument, and we recommended that that be removed first. And then we suggested that the city engage with the artistic and creative communities to reimagine what Monument Avenue could be if statuary were removed, or whether or not they could be added context, whether that was historical context or whether it was something as simple as different artwork attached to it, similar to what one sees in Manhattan, at Wall Street, where you have the bull, and for a while there was Fearless Girl that was placed and gave it a slightly different meaning and a different power, right? And then the fourth recommendation that we gave really had to do, again, with sort of a process of local control. So what's interesting to me, during the protest in the summer of 2020 around George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, many of those things that we recommended came to pass in Richmond, including the legislature, both houses of the Virginia legislature and the governor's office were all voted Democratic, who were all open to changing the law. So that happened. And so it brings us to where we are today. And the one standout was the Lee Monument, which had been gifted to the state of Virginia. So that became a legislative piece, and it's just stunning. Subsequently, because of the protest, the pedestal is being regarded as one of the finest pieces of protest art in the nation. And so now there are questions about what to do with the pedestal as we reimagine what Monument Avenue can look like moving forward.
I think it's so extraordinary, right? Like all of these really kind of technical insights that you're sharing of what has to happen behind the scene to be responsive to this, kind of watershed cultural moment. And Stefan, I want to turn this over to you because in a lot of ways, part of the reason we're bringing you in on this conversation is because Germany has already done a tremendous amount of work in grappling with darker moments of history and figuring out what that looks like in public spaces. From some research that I did, there was a real cultural reckoning, after a period of kind of like silence and denial immediately after the Holocaust in the 1960s, there was this cultural reckoning of the next generation. And there's a German term to it, Vergangenheitsverarbeitung, you'll correct me, that translates as working off the past. Can you describe a little bit more about what went into that moment in the 1960s and how that has shaped Germany moving forward in terms of how it relates to its past?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Rabbi, for the initiative and Christy to be there. I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion. And we are talking about Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. This is a typical German word. Mark Twain was right to a certain extent, saying that the German language has so long words and it's so hard to learn. But please allow me to start, at the end of the Second World War. We had, in fact, what I have been saying, in Germany, the Shoah and the Nazi era, just after the war, was rather confronted with denial and mental suppression, like, what happened? I don't know. And even the request to finally drawing a line under the past. And Schlussstrich ziehen, which is really, if you say that, forget about it, we don't talk about it, that's it. And that was the attitude of the majority of German society just after the war. And there was a widespread attitude to even make excuses and to describe oneself as innocent victim of history. Imagine the Germans who were the main perpetrators and who incited all this. People would say, we are also the victims. And that was a discourse, of course, also of denial. And let me, and I'm paraphrasing here, and just to give an impression what people said in this time, it was like, oh, it was also bad for us. Our country was destroyed. There were also crimes committed against us. We lost territory. Our soldiers also fought for our honor. This was really a discourse which was very irritating. I was not yet born at that time. I was born in '57. And then it's still, I remember, I come from a Jewish Christian background. I remember my parents, my mother especially, who came from the Jewish side, they're talking already when I was a kid about this time. And my awareness is a little bit different from those Germans who were not affected by the Nazi regime or differently affected by the Nazi regime or who were a part of it. And um, I learned that in the 63, 64, we had the so-called Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt. That was the first time really they got to trial perpetrators who served in Auschwitz concentration camp and Bergen-Belsen, who were the first time they were really put to court. This was a big controversy in Germany. What shall we do with these people? Are these people are just, they just receive orders and they are not responsible, or they're totally 100% responsible? There was a huge discussion going on, and that started a certain process of awareness, but among, I would say, the more intellectual circles and the political people, those who are very sensitive to all this. But the wider public was not reached yet. It was still a time to become. Now, I'll tell you something. You might be surprised. I remember when I was a student, uh, we had in Germany this, perhaps the American TV miniseries Holocaust with Meryl Streep as the main actress. It's a starring actress, and it tells a story. It's a TV show. It's a TV series. It shows the story of a German Jewish family during the Nazi regime.
Stefan, forgive me for interrupting. If you would just vocalize a little louder, a couple of
Okay,
folks have
okay. Is
indicated
that better
difficulty
now?
hearing you.
Okay, this was a story of a German Jewish family who would be murdered in the Holocaust, and being opposed to the story of a German non-Jewish family who was who were collaborators and working inverted commas, of course, in the Holocaust horror. And this was a, I remember that myself, that this was because you have also this idea what was really, what sparked this kind of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. This, in my personal perception, what I learned at that time was people started, kids started, students started to ask their teachers, their parents, what was going on. And there were, you wouldn't believe it, 20 million Germans saw that miniseries. You have to know that at that time, divided Germany, we had about 60 million Germans in West Germany. This was, the miniseries was not broadcasted into GDR. So 20 million people saw that. This is amazing. All ages, and people were calling the broadcasting system of West Germany, crying literally and saying, what is this? What has happened? And then I remember my dad was working at the Ministry for Science and Education in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. And I said to him, because so I know the story, I learned that from my own family. But I said to him, what are they doing now for teachers for the Holocaust education in Germany? Do they have material? And he said, I will check it. And he brought me a huge new material based on the Holocaust miniseries for answers and questions and answers for pupils and teachers to teach people. And this was really the point of departure in my perceptions. There are different points of departures as well, but the Holocaust series was really, I remember people crying. This was something which was necessary. And some people, there was, of course, criticism of certain people in Germany denying still the past, who would say this is typical American soft opera, and this is kitsch. We do not like that. And
Hmm.
but this was a minority. Fortunately, they would say this is propaganda. But the vast majority of Germans started really to ask questions, and then I would say this was somehow the starting point of another German word, Erinnerungskultur, which means the culture of commemoration, which is flanked by education, by rituals, of course, by it's really a vast network of Holocaust teaching, of remembering and everything. And more and more, I remember the kids of my friends, they would have Holocaust education, they would have projects, they would talk to survivors. What we see in the United States for a very long time, we started with that. And we had survivors talking to the people, to the kids, and explaining. And from then on, we really have this kind of Erinnerungskultur, which we have to stick to. And there's a vast majority of Germans, they say we have to do that. If we forget the past will start again. So that is This is a very important sentence.
Yeah.
If you don't talk about the past, it will repeat itself.
I mean, I think a striking parallel for me is the role that media has to be a flashpoint or a catalyst, right? And this Holocaust series in Germany in the 1960s, and the visual for the United States in the George Floyd murder, and seeing that and what that sparked, right? There's this kind of collective awareness it's always been underneath the surface. It's just something lifts the lid to allow it to enter into the public conversation. So Christy, let me turn it back over to you. We're at a crossroads that feels a lot like the 1960s in Germany in some ways. But we don't have the same kind of rationale of, oh, it's 20 years after this collective historical trauma and tragedy, and now a new generation is questioning it, right? We're hundreds of years out of the Civil War, the legacy of slavery, the continued issues of civil rights, just starting these conversations around Indigenous Americans. I'm curious if you have thoughts about why this moment is happening now for us. What is sparking it, aside from the George Floyd video from last year? What is bringing this to the surface now?
Okay, so I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that this is not just a moment. This is a continuum. Okay, and this continuum has been going on for 150 plus years. At the end of the American Civil War, the same types of trauma and denial and anger and rejection of what the slaveholding South and the collaborating North were doing, because we need to be clear that while slavery was existing in the South, New York banks, real estate, railroad, all of those things, slavery was the most valuable national industry enterprise, and it was supported by a variety of people. So when the Civil War ends and freedom is granted, and then the progressives of the period decide to go one step further by granting equal citizenships, the right to vote, right? All of that to these newly freed people. That was viewed as an affront, because you have a whole system that was built with the core belief in white supremacy. And that didn't go away. And so the reconciliation of white people was easy to do off the backs of Black people and Indigenous people and the immigrant communities that had participated to end this war. And so for the nation to heal, that's exactly what they did. Their healing was on the back of the formerly enslaved. And so, and the compromise was Jim Crow. And when Jim Crow, when Reconstruction was abandoned, we're taught that Reconstruction failed. And this is how it creeps into our educational systems. We've always been taught that Reconstruction was a failure. Reconstruction was not a failure. It was the real birth of expanded democracy and what it meant. It's when we got true free exercise of religion that impacted all kinds of folks. It's when we got public schools. It's when we got public libraries, where we got road systems, government involved in the expansion of interstate commerce and the like. It was an extraordinary period of progressiveness. And it was shifting political power in significant ways. And that was not acceptable. And so when Reconstruction was abandoned as being too expensive for the federal government, Jim Crow was allowed to take its place. And the majority of those gains were lost. So people have been protesting against these monuments when they first went up in the 1890s. People have been protesting about them each and every step of the way. What has taken the lid off, I think, more contemporarily, because there's always this cycle, always this cycle of expansion and contraction of American democracy and ideals in our past. And we had a period of considerable expansion of democracy and rights, personal rights, etc. And we have just been through one of the most significant backlashes to that progressivism. And as such, and we are seeing it continuing to play out, and that has taken the lid off these lingering issues where just enough has been given to equalize or to provide equity and rights. Just enough is to be given supposedly to just kind of put you back into a quiet place, to where I think the nexus of the pandemic, the nexus of that political backlash, I think all of those things have come together and saw communities across the country. It wasn't just about George Floyd. George Floyd was yet another example of unequalness, injustice, and people were able to hold on to that. And the pandemic also revealed other inequities in our society, right? And so people with all of that tension, all of that frustration, that want a more progressive approach kind of took to the streets. And the people who want to cling to status quo and or a more conservative approach became more virulent. And that's what we saw and what we see playing out. The difference, there's another difference too. America has never really, unlike Germany, America has never thought that, as a whole, we were taught that slavery was actually a good thing for Black people, right? We were taught that it was relatively a benign institution, despite all the historical documentation and things of that sort. There has never been the kind of, I never been that full scale sort of reckoning that Germany experienced about its past in the US. We simply haven't had it. There have been spots of it, but we simply haven't had it. And we, worse still, put in our minds that, oh, we are so far removed from all of that hate and prejudice of that time that, it's failing to see the systemic things that were, deliberately put in place behind that notion. So, and are still in place. And that's what people are also fighting against. So I think, historically speaking, that has been one of the most interesting things to me. And I will say, some of in terms of sort of public scale, just think about this for a moment. The first, National Museum to African American History and Culture didn't open until 2016 in the United States. But when did the first museum devoted to the Holocaust, which didn't happen on our shores, right? And so it is easy to look outward and bring that into the American experience, but the crimes of our nation state against its people have been far more difficult because we have a very different narrative that we have tried to frame of, land of the free and home of the brave. And so to address those issues, we would have to acknowledge that those things are actually not as we would have them to be.
Very powerful. I noticed in the chat that Adam got us started by adding a question into the chat, and I'm going to go through a few more questions that I have for the panelists first, and then we're going to get to the questions that you all have. But feel free to go ahead and start adding your questions to the chat now, and as Jania mentioned, we will get to as many as possible. Part of what you're pointing to, Christy, is this notion of history as a mix of discovery of the past, of constructed memory, and of revision of that memory that we construct. And you've also pointed to the fact that some people have a disposition that is more towards progressivism and more towards conservatism, right? So how do we as a society navigate the tension between those who demand more revision to the constructed narratives and those who are resistant to that revision? What does it look like to still create a shared national project among folks with very different impulses in this conversation? And both Stefan and Christy, I mean, I'd be curious to get your insights from the different cultural contexts.
Well, if I may.
Well,
Sorry.
yeah,
Sorry,
please.
Christy, no, go ahead, please.
I was simply going to say we have to acknowledge that when it comes to how we choose to express public history, it's really based on three core concepts. There's the history itself. That's the forensic evidence that is available to us about the past, and it brings in these various disciplines. You know, whether it is the oral history, the document that's been left behind, the photograph, etc., the archaeology, the anthropology, all of those things are a part of our evidence that helps us understand and frame the large picture of what happened in the past. And then there's this thing called memory, which is a bit trickier because memory is really very personal. Memory is, you know exactly where you were on September 11th, 2001, and you can recite that. But if I were to say that our national narrative was going to be built solely around your particular experience, it would be incomplete. And we can all acknowledge that. But that's pretty much what we've done with the past. We've taken one segment of the side and said, this is the historical past for our nation. And then the third element is what we call heritage. And that is the story that we have chosen to tell ourselves. And it will have fragments of the history and it will have fragments of the memory. But the whole purpose is for a community to find its collective self. Well, in my line of work, my goal is to make sure that that cultural heritage that we try to frame, that legacy that we are being left, is as informed as possible by more of the forensic and the memory shaping, and that guides what the heritage is, not what we feel we need in a moment in time. Because there are a lot of people right now who say, we really need to come up with this narrative that's going to bring us all together. Well, that's what heritage building does. That's why we had statues of Confederate generals and the expectation, well, the majority of us feel like those are our heroes. Meanwhile, you're asking my ancestry to look at something and look at an individual. And then if I am wrong, if I ask the question, how would you feel if I erected a statue of the person who beat, assaulted, raped my ancestor and put him in the public square? But I am wrong to ask that question. And that's kind of how people of color feel around some of these issues and some of these people. But that's the three that you're dealing with: history, heritage, and memory. And so if we can construct a healthy cultural narrative with each other, that's great. You know, I tell people all the time, you can really love your drunk uncle, but if we as a family are going to heal, we have to acknowledge he's an alcoholic and what that means for us to be healthy as a family moving forward. You see what I'm saying? You can do both things.
Yeah. So, I mean, perhaps this is an artful transition, but speaking of drunk uncles, right? Stefan, the alternative for Germany, right? You have this AfD party that has really emerged with a resistance to this generally embraced identity that Germany has of remorse and facing the history of the Holocaust, that kind of rejects that consensus that has been built in the nation. How is Germany grappling with the rise of the rejection of a narrative that has embraced the difficulty and trauma of the Holocaust?
The good thing is that in Germany, the vast majority of the population is really, really understanding the past and really trying to understand and also to be a part of this culture of commemoration. If you're talking about the AfD people, they are fortunately, if I may say so, a minority still. And what I always saying, how to convince people. Sometimes people say you cannot convince certain certain fanatics, you will never ever reach them. But I do also, because Christy mentioned memory. Memory is and also exchange, memory, facts, and dialogue. Sometimes you bring people, if you talk to a person like you are wrong, you're a racist, or you are anti-Semitic, and you aggress, you just attack, that's that's okay, but you should rather, with a lot of patience, to try to educate smoothly people, talk about it. Also, when it comes to children, imagine an AFD person is talking a certain way, and the kid comes home from school and telling another story. And they're always saying to me, education is in the center of anything against xenophobia or racism or anti-Semitism. The best thing is always to teach, to educate, and to share memories. And what I really admire in the United States is this um, culture also of commemoration. And I'm always very touched when I see and watch and talk to survivors in the Museum of the Holocaust in Los Angeles, or the Museum of Tolerance. You talk to real people and they share. You see this old lady, this old gentleman, they suffered tremendous things. And only the hardest and coldest, icy persons would not react to that. And it's so important to meet people, to share memories. We are lucky and we are really blessed by the fact that there are still survivors among us. And always saying these people, they are ambassadors of memory. And also in Germany, more and more we have these people even coming from abroad back to Germany after all this suffering, being a part of it and trying to make things better. And also in my consulate, I'm very really I'm blessed and I'm really grateful to all those uh, former Germans who are deprived of their citizenship by Nazi Germany and are asking it back. They always say thank you to me when I give them the certificate. I always say no, I have to thank you. That's just the other way around. And these people start to say, there was one lady about 80 years old. She said to me, where are you from? I said, from Cologne, West Germany. Do you know Berlin? I said, yes, I have an apartment in Berlin. And she said, where? And I said, the street. And she said, oh, my grandfather had a factory just 2 streets away from yours. I mean, this is breathtaking. And I always saying memory and facts. And when I hear the word narrative, to me it's always like we have to fill the narrative with so many facts we can really gather from everywhere. We can we can convince certain people, we can't convince them, but I would say most people we can convince with a kind of, we take them in our arms and say, hey, listen to me, see this person, see what this person suffered. Just to confront them. Some people deny, they don't see it. If you go to certain places in Germany, you can take people by the hand and say, look, that's a bad thing. We have the Holocaust Memorial next to the Berlin Gate in Berlin, which is was very much discussed. But when people go there, and we have of course some perpetrators, they make fun of it, whatever. But if you see people entering it, they don't talk anymore. This is important, just to create also this kind of effect. I remember when I was a kid in 72, we had the attack on the Israeli team at the Olympics in Germany, in Munich, of all places. And Germany at that time was acknowledged already that it's on a good way to deal with the past and really to talk about it. And then this happened. In Germany, I remember that people were as shocked as later when we had the Holocaust TV series. And this is important. People have to be confronted with facts, confronted with people, and also with our dear survivors. And this is important. And also, the Shoah Foundation here in Los Angeles is a Spielberg initiative, and they make interviews of Holocaust survivors. They ask these poor people thousands of questions, and then you can interact and get answers. This is something you can really bring people together. This is really something you should really rely on. So to summarize, yes, memory is important, heritage is important. Our heritage, our German heritage, yes, it's Beethoven, it's Einstein, it's Bach, yes, but our heritage is also this past, which is an abyss in history. So we have to live with both. and we are not the victims of something. No, we were the perpetrators. And the, Goethe, our great writer, he spoke German, but also the commander of Auschwitz. So is the German language bad then? So always again, we have to confront, we have to discuss, we get together as people, not just reading books. I think all of us, we have been reading books a lot, sure, and we know facts. No, it's to embrace somebody, to share, and to try. Never ever stop trying to bring. Try to convince with your heart, and with facts.
I think that the
I would like to contribute to this. I could talk for hours. I tell you.
well, I think that the language that you bring forward of confrontation, right? It sounds difficult, but it's also really important. Um, I'm curious from both of your perspectives. Uh, do you think that there has been a moment where the re-examination of history has gone too far, that the confrontation has been counterproductive? Do you have any examples of that? Or do you think that this is the confrontations are necessary and the backlash is just inherently built in, and hopefully we just pendulum swing, but eventually we make progress, right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Or do you think that there are examples where that confrontation is counterproductive? Either of you.
If I may say, just with regard to
And
this.
Stefan, just yell because people are
Yes,
still.
I yell. I'm sorry. Sorry for everybody. It's a technological problem. I would say if the problem of guilt and responsibility are two things. If you teach children in Germany or anywhere in the world, you are guilty for something. People who are born after the horror, after the Shoah, that is difficult. Then you might push too far, because out of guilt there could be created rejection, and this is wrong. But you have to teach responsibility. You cannot choose. I choose Beethoven and Goethe, but I forget about the Shoah. No way. You have to learn this. But if you push people in feeling guilty, young people, you might create a counter effect, which is not what we want. So you always say to have to bring people together and take them by their hands, but not say you are guilty. This is, you are responsible for the past. You have to be a part of the dialogue, you have to be a part of the memory, and to share it. But because you have been asking, where it went too far. When I talk to young people in Germany, the majority is really, they're really wonderful, they really react. But some say, why I'm not responsible for this. It's understandable. It's a child. So you have to be smooth. And I'm coming back to our survivors. These people, there is an old lady that could be the grandma or the great grandma. And that is something of this kid listening. So it is important always not to overdo in the sense of feeling guilty, but feeling responsible. That is what I would summarize what I have been saying.
Thank you. Christy, what are your thoughts?
I would agree with that. There is a certain level of responsibility, and sometimes that responsibility is generational. And I don't think we can. To your primary question at the beginning is, can you go too far? I really don't think so. If the goal of exposing these truths is that it's about exposing the truths. I just don't. I don't think you can ever go too far when you are sharing what actually happened, right? It's up to us to figure out how we choose to navigate that information. I think, when it comes to slavery in particular in the United States, we have a habit here where plantation houses we view as extraordinary places of architecture and a place to have your wedding. We don't view it as a work camp or a death camp. To the, dozens or hundreds of lives that made that house or that property profitable. We don't think about it that way because that's not how it's been presented up to us, right? So I'm curious what questions folks have to say, Rabbi, because this has been an extraordinary conversation. So I'm looking forward to hear what others may have questions for us about.
Well, so one that comes to mind first is this is from Sue. She's bringing about the notion that the United States and Germany have different legal approaches to speech and to what is allowed, and putting confines and boundaries on what is tolerated when something is clearly transgressive of fact or goes into dangerous political territory. So Sue asked, how does Germany deal with social media platforms and denial of the Holocaust?
We have a commissioner to combat anti-Semitism, Felix Klein. You might know he's a part of the German government, and he's always in his discourses mentioning the social media. We do have legal procedures to do that, and sometimes there are certain social media involved. We always get in contact with them, and our talking about also the freedom of expression. I think it's your First Amendment, right? Yes, right. So we in Germany, for example, penalize the denial of the Holocaust. If you say the Holocaust never existed, you are punished by law. It's a penal law. In some countries, they would say you can say whatever you want. You can say there was no Holocaust, nobody was killed, whatever. In some countries, it's protected by their laws. In Germany, we decided our freedom of speech is I would say comparable to what you to the First Amendment, but there are limits based on our history, because to deny the Holocaust also could excite public opinion. If people are trying to do this via the social media, it's even worse, because social media are platforms for fake news, for fake things, and we saw, unfortunately, these days, anti-Semitism uh, on the social media, and they freely somehow flow around before somebody gets them and say, "Hey, what's going on here?" This is, to my view, and please don't. Nobody should take me wrong. I shouldn't say that. But sometimes I say non-social media, because sometimes the discourse is not based on human values. But this has nothing to do with the system, which is wonderful. The social media bring us together, especially these days. But at the same time, it's a place for those people who would never, before social media, before the internet, would come about and curse. You would not see them. But now they have really an audience, which is it's in millions and millions of people. That's a danger. And also answering to the question is, we are very vigilant in Germany, and our prosecuting offices are watching all this. And it is the good thing is we have a very good sensitivity in our population, that people are really picking up these and saying, "Hey, did you read that or this?" And they bring that to the attention of the authorities. So there is a kind of self-cleaning, to put it this way, process within our society. But still, these people are still around. Also, racist people, xenophobic people, homophobic people. They are still around, and they're quite hard to combat. And sometimes to find people on this internet, you cannot reach even with love and dialogue, unfortunately.
Right. Christy, you knew this one was coming. Do you want to dive into CRT, into critical race theory? Why you sense it's such a hot button issue across the country now, and how that fits in to this larger conversation of memory, heritage, history?
Critical race theory has been around for over 40 years. And the only reason why it is a thing now is because a group of historians and journalists decided that they wanted to see if that theory played out in terms of the social fabric, right? Known as the 1619 Project. And people lost their minds because it disrupted the heritage narrative we had created for ourselves. Now, I think the whole thing, personally, I find it silly. Critical race theory is not something that's widespread in its truest sense. It is not something that's widespread or found generally in our museums. It certainly isn't found in our K through 12. It never has been. And so the what I am finding is that, you know, we certainly have been asked the question, are you doing critical race theory at your museum? You know, you have to ask them what they're really asking me about. You know, if you're asking if we have diverse perspectives of what settlement was like and colonialism was like, absolutely. If you are asking me about something else, you know, are we creating programming to make white kids feel bad? No, we're not. You know, I mean, it's really underlying it is finding a new word, just like they use the word woke, right? It's co-opting something and turning it into something else, trying to turn something into a derivative, you know, a negative piece. And they're quite good at that, you know. It's the best in propaganda, really. So I am not going to be so dismissive of what is happening with this conversation around critical race theory, because it's important. But I do also acknowledge that of the 6 primary um, tenets of critical race theory, that I just don't know that that is something that could ever really live in general public space, because the concepts are really quite complex, and again have been dealt with for 40 years as a conversational and study period to really understand how race and racism and white supremacy actually does infect and affect our legal frameworks, because that's really what it's about, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question that kind of bridges the two speakers. People who visit Auschwitz acknowledge the horror and reality of the Holocaust. Christy, what do you think we should do with the plantations that you mentioned?
I can name a handful of plantation sites that have done an extraordinary job of transitioning their locations to talk about the enslaved people at those properties. Um, you know, Somerset Place in North Carolina, the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, the James Madison property, Mount Pillier in Orange, Virginia, is one of the leading places on archaeology of the Black experience in the 17th and 18th century. There are others, but for the most part, you know, these are treated as architectural tours, and so throughout the South, and so it's not something that and what I have found is that many sites, and there are others who are doing um, more integrated work, like say a Mount Vernon. Monticello has done an extraordinary job with framing Jefferson and the place as a reflection of Jefferson and the enslavement and the Sally Hemings reality and all of this. Monticello has done an extraordinary job, but those places are few and far between to the vast landscape. Americans want to go and see the pretty gardens. They want to go and see the pretty houses, and they imagine themselves sitting on the porches of these places drinking mint juleps, right? I mean, it's a whole fantasy to which Hollywood has been a part of that, building out that narrative, right? And so I think I don't anticipate that there will be much change there until leadership of those places change, the excuses in those places change. Frankly, the financial model that most museums and cultural institutions have to operate from, you know, and their reliance on philanthropy and or government funding. So they're at the whims of this idea of heritage making versus historical reckoning. All of those things, I think, are part of the dynamic.
Thank you. Stefan,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of, Germany, it's had a very different approach to taking these spaces, even the markers on the streets, right, of acknowledging that something tragic and awful happened here. Can you speak a little bit about the process of the intentional commemoration and use of public space in Germany to hold that memory?
I have a very nice example. We have the project of the stumbling stones. I'm sure you know that they look
Oh, yeah.
golden, and they are really in the pavement. And you see the names
Mhm.
of those who were deported and murdered, and not only Jewish people, but mainly Jewish people, of course. And if you go to streets in Germany, everywhere you find these stones. There are some places there is an overwhelming amount of, let's say, one house where 3 or 4 Jewish families, you see 10 or 12 even more stones. And this project was very touching and very successful, as a strange word perhaps, but it was very successful in creating the memory. I see people on the street, they would stop. What is it? And then they realize it's a stumbling stone. And what I'm doing when I walk to the streets of Europe, especially Germany, and I see these stones, I just stop and read the names. That's just a way to bring them back a bit. I mean, you understand what I mean? Just in honoring them, just in reading their names. And I served, as you said in my biography, I was in Rome before I came to Los Angeles, and I lived very close to the former Jewish ghetto, just a couple of streets away from my house. And there was one street, it was covered with gold. I mean, normally, if you cover streets with gold, it means something, wow, wonderful, power. But this was something horrible. You see a small street, a little Gasse, in this former ghetto of Rome, which is, I mean, I would say the gold stones are more than the others. And therefore, it's a very strong sign. I just want to give you this example. There are very many others. There's, for example, a project in Berlin by a couple, a lady and a gentleman. They put symbols on street lights, like a cat or like a bag. Just, at first you see what is it. Or, for example, a skirt. They put that skirt on a light just next to the place where a lot of Jewish shops were selling clothes and textiles everywhere. This was a textile neighborhood in Berlin. So you saw, at first you see, what is that all about, that skirt? The skirt symbolizes Jewish life in Germany. So you find things, you smile, there's a cat or there's something, and you ask the question, what is that all about? And that is very good because this attracts people with the kind of what it is behind. The classical monument, of course, you have classical monuments commemorating, you see sculptures of victims, which are also very touching. This is, I would say, this is classical, if I may say so, commemoration. But these stumbling stones, I always come back to them. You stumble because you're afraid to touch something, and this is exactly, you should not stumble on people. But the idea is you stop in front of the stone and you remember. That is a wonderful thing. As sad and horrible that is, at that very moment, I always say, if you guys are in Europe and see these stones, stop in front of them. Just read the names. That's it, and think of the
It's
people. It's
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 both,
really
it's
something.
passive and it's
Like,
confrontational, right, at the same time. And Stephanie brings up in the chat, it would be interesting to think of what would be the equivalent here, in the United States, right? What would be our equivalent in facing our history with something that is passive and confrontational and just integrated into the landscape, instead of focusing on, or in addition to focusing on, the large scale public monuments. Um, we're nearing the end of our time, which I just want to I want to thank you guys so much for the insights. And this is everything that I would hope it would have been, in terms of learning from the history of Germany, and what you're still grappling with, and kind of the different constraints that you've put around your collective narrative. And Christy, the bravery of how you have waded into this conversation at a really critical moment of a flashpoint and where we are in American history and understanding of ourselves. I want, first of all, we had the question of, are there any writings that you two have done that we can follow up, that we can read more and gain more insight into your work? So feel free for self-promotion here. And the last question that I want to ask is around, what are the ways that we can lower the temperature and still successfully have this conversation? How can we invite more people in to this really important work of understanding our collective selves and extend it as an invitation rather than setting up these kind of cultural flashpoints that we seem to be falling into as a trap? So self-promotion and how do we fix it? Go.
Chrissy, I'm sure you are, I think you can have so many publications. My publications
I would say the
Please, go
simplest
ahead.
thing is just
Go
to
ahead.
Google me. I haven't written anything specific lately. Well, that's not entirely true. I tend to contribute to volumes versus writing my own work at this point, a single volume. And more than anything else, if you Google me, you will see a variety of videos on this topic, and if you're really interested in whatever the random things around these issues of history, culture, and memory, feel free to follow me on Twitter. You can find me at History Gone Wrong.
I also heard Christy on a really fabulous podcast called Uncivil. So Google Christy Coleman,
Yep.
Uncivil. That one was fantastic. Stefan, how about you?
Well, it's just said how to bring down the temperature. I would say my answer is don't bring it down, because we have to be vigilant. If we bring it down, I mean, it's my personal point of view. We have to keep it hot. That is very important. Not in heating and creating aggressiveness, but to be aggressive in being in really tackling with the issue. And I say something which might sound strange to you. Kindness. Start with kindness in dialogue, and be unkind when it's come to blow up, of course. But kindness, sometimes you make people speechless when they attack you, and you just say, please, what we are talking about, my dear. It works sometimes. It's strange, but I, in my personal point of view, in my professional experience, sometimes it works. It's not be kind in accepting anti-Semitism and racism. No, not at all. But if a person aggresses you, try first with kindness to convince. And if it doesn't work, be brave and really that things never happen again. So it's always to find that way. But I would say keep the temperature and try to do that in kindness and with facts and also sharing memories, I would say.
Important point. It's not important to bring down the temperature if you're not addressing what needs to be addressed. Christy?
I would agree 100% with what he said. It always makes me nervous when people say, oh, we've got to calm things down so we can talk. No, we need to hear what people are saying and what they are feeling, so that we can form some level of understanding before we can enter into any kind of meaningful conversation. Because these are, an uneasy peace for injustice is not really worth it, in my view.
Not only is it not worth it, but it's just going to keep resurrecting until we do deal with it.
Precisely.
Well, I wish I had rabbinic words that were even more wise that I could complete the conversation with, but I think that is probably the most beautiful and important note to end on, is that we have a lot of work to do in our society here. There's a lot to learn from Germany. Germany has things to learn from us. And let's keep at it. Let's keep at this process and understand that we have a lot of introspection left to do. Perhaps the most important message on the high holidays is you can never stop re-examining. So Christy, Stefan, I'm so grateful to you for your time. We have your names in the chat. People can look you up and follow up more later. But thank you all for joining our Barrett Conversation series. And of course, thank you to the Barrett Family Foundation, as always, for making these difficult, confrontational, insightful, introspective conversations possible. We will see you all at our contemplative service and at our Yizkor and our Ne'ilah to finish out Yom Kippur. Wishing everybody Gemar Tov and a Zoom call. Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you for having me.
All the best. Shalom, sei gesund.
Bye.